Yes, I can see
Great.
you and
So,
hear
hi everyone.
you.
My name's Sandwell. I'm from Imperial London and the GPA coordination. And I'm here to talk about sizing the challenge and giving an overview of the scale of the decarbonisation challenge in the humanitarian sector. To be clear, I'll be zooming out to the global scale, but I'll be also focusing back in on energy infrastructure and how we can decarbonise that. So this presentation was also put together between myself and also one of my colleagues, Mark Gibbs. So in terms of understanding the GPA to understanding the
Philip,
challenge, I mean, the first thing
Philip,
that we've heard from the other speakers already is that
Philip,
understanding the challenge is a challenge in itself.
Philip, just to
Hi,
interrupt you, the sound is a bit bad.
I
It
think it's a
seems
bit of
like
a lag.
yes, if you mind switching off your video, it seems like there is some network issues. So please switch off your video so that we can hear you better. Perfect.
Sure. Hopefully you can hear me a bit better now.
Yes, it is much better. Thank you.
Great. Um, Thanks. Yeah, as I was saying, and as we heard from the other speakers, understanding the challenge is a huge challenge in itself. Seemingly every time when we have these kinds of discussions, we hear about how scarce data is. So we heard already from Marianne from GIZ the effort that you need to go into in order to get good site assessment level data in order to design effective decarbonisation projects. We also heard earlier from Catherine as well about the diversity of different contexts. So the needs of decarbonisation, let's say in a head office in Geneva, is going to be very different from a warehouse in Nairobi or a logistics centre or even within a humanitarian settlement itself or a displacement settlement itself. Within that context, even there could be differences in how energy might be used for water pumping or for critical services for healthcare or for supplying the energy needs of displaced people themselves. And finally, we also heard from Bruno about how the scale is global. So, of course, we're operating in many different countries across different continents. The need for a standardized methodology across different organizations was something Bruno highlighted. And there's also different mechanisms under which this could be rolled out. So something that really comes to the foreground is that we need to understand the size and scale of the total challenge if we're going to understand how to be able to do something about it and how to implement solutions, hopefully across the world. So some of the work we've been doing in the GPA, let me just flick through it all so you can see it, was consultations with 6 UN agencies and ICRC. And the aim of this was to try and get an estimate on the total number of diesel generators, diesel and petrol generators across the world. And the estimate that we came to was around 11,000. Now, we are confident that this is an underestimate based on the kind of level of confidence that some of our partners were able to provide us with data, but we think there's around 11,000. Using that, we can consider how these generators are typically used in terms of their hours of usage, the efficiency of these machines, how they might be operated, the cost of fuel and the emissions and so on. And that will give us a range of parameters. Like every diesel generator will be operated in different ways, but kind of on aggregate, we can get a good idea of the total position across the world. We then feed this into one of the statistical models that we've developed. This accounts for the kind of variability between individual situations. And it feeds us with a global scale estimate of the costs, a global scale estimate of the emissions, and hopefully a global scale potential for decarbonisation. And then we can start looking at what about the different impacts and pathways we can take. So we already heard from Catherine about the effects of different energy efficiency proposals before you move on to solarization, and also the kind of different financing that might be needed. So in terms of the results that we came up with, firstly, a caveat, this is all strongly dependent on the input data, which, as we said, can be quite hard to come by. But our estimates are that across the humanitarian sector, around $120 million is being spent every year on fuel, and that emits about 225 kilotons of CO2. To put that in context, I think a flight between Geneva and Nairobi is about 1 ton, and this is 225,000 tons of CO2. If you then include the grid, similar to some of Catherine's estimates actually, the costs increase by about $60 million per year. In terms of what we can do about it, there's lots of different decarbonisation pathways we can take, as we heard from the previous speaker. But if we have a global target of 80% CO2 reduction, which is in line with some of the targets from the UN Secretariat, and we take an energy efficiency and combined solarization approach to achieve that 80% reduction, it means that we need a total investment in the order of $580 million. But in terms of the return on investment, that can come in terms of the reduced costs of about 145 million. So that total investment of that total portfolio can also manage to pay itself off in about 4, 5, 6 years, which is similar to the single system projects that we heard earlier too. So if it's all so easy, why hasn't it happened yet? We've already heard some of the challenges from the previous speakers. High capital costs of renewable systems are not really compatible with the annual budget cycles of many humanitarian organizations. Donor interest in the past has been a bit more limited. There's a status quo towards diesel generation. And also some of these projects are very small. Speaking as a private sector developer, a single project might not be that attractive, but bundling them together, for example, could increase that kind of interest. What it means is that there's also opportunities called energy as a service. So we heard a bit about this from Marianne. And this is also something that was identified from a series of workshops led by the GPA and the other organizations on that document, which shows that energy as a service could be one of the best steps forward in terms of decarbonizing the humanitarian sector. What is it? Well, we heard a little bit earlier, but essentially it's a contract or an agreement between an energy service company and an organization, let's say a UN agency. You might have heard of a power purchase agreement or PPA or a lease agreement. These are all kinds of energy as a service opportunities. And essentially is an agreement between the energy service company to provide a certain amount of power for a certain price to a customer. And it has a lot of advantages. Number one is it means that the energy service company can take on a lot of risks that a humanitarian agency might not be able to do. So it cover the risk and responsibility of the financing. The energy company can look after warranties, service guarantees, and so on. And it also means they can lead the operation and maintenance of these systems too. It also means you can get more efficiencies from invoking the private sector power here. So we can use the knowledge and know-how and management experience from the private sector. We can offer lower costs and project delivery in a faster timeline, and also offers opportunities for livelihoods for displaced people themselves and skills transfer in terms of looking after those systems on the ground in the long term. In terms of the challenges, there's two main ones. Opportunities being hindered by one, different approaches to contractual arrangements and risk profiles. To put it nicely, your average UN agency has a very different risk profile and attitude to contracts to a much smaller private entity. And number two, typically UN agencies have a standard termination clause, which means that the organization can leave at any point or at very little notice, which is not an ideal arrangement if you're a private company looking for a long-term investment over several years. Luckily, two of these things have been previously looked at by the GPA as well. These documents are available on Energypedia. The first is a standard set of contractual terms, which means that these kinds of organizations or agencies and the private sector can use a similar language that's more amenable to both in terms of developing these agreements. The second, something I'll talk a bit more about, is called a de-risking mechanism, which is developed by the GPA and is essentially to protect the private sector from this, frankly, quite scary termination clause that the UN can exercise. How does the de-risking mechanism work? It's got two phases. The first is a liquidity facility. Essentially, if a UN agency or another agency needs to leave for whatever reason, then the private company is afforded a 12-month period under which to find alternative users for that energy system. So given that the system's been installed, they can look around and see other potential off-takers of the energy service or other uses of that energy. And it gives them a 12-month window under which to do that after the agency has left. Phase two, sometimes that won't always be possible. It's called a guarantee mechanism. So it means if it's not possible to take up one of these other opportunities in the 12-month period, then the costs of that termination are covered for the private sector. And it comes with a number of advantages. Number one is that it reduces the risk, especially to the private sector. It means that that point number two of the UN agency leaving is effectively eliminated, and it means that the risk to the company is much reduced. Hopefully that will encourage more bids by private companies that now can take on a lower level of risk, and you have more interest in your expressions of interest. From there, you can hopefully provide energy to anchor clients. So a humanitarian agency could be the anchor customer within a mini-grid, for example. That could allow opportunities for cross-subsidization for other users, let's say displaced people themselves. And finally, and perhaps most importantly, it means that each actor in this can focus on their own core mandates. It means the agency or the organization can focus on delivering services to displaced people, and the energy service company can do what they do best in terms of supplying energy. This isn't all theoretical. There are a few examples in action. We heard about some earlier, but also we have the IOM base in Malakal in South Sudan has been implemented under an energy as a service model. UNHCR are looking at 10 sites across East Africa, and the EOI has been completed. And there's also a multi-agency decarbonisation project happening in Nigeria. For the accountants among us, leasing can be flagged as a possible loan under international public sector accounting standards. And some high-level modelling, different from what I showed earlier, suggests that a small fund, of just $6 million, could underwrite a much larger investment, 10 times larger, of $65 million. So having just a smaller investment can unlock 10 times the funding, and that could translate into around 700 humanitarian facilities. So to conclude, let's be honest with ourselves, decarbonising the humanitarian sector will be a huge challenge. It's not going to be easy, but we do have the means and the tools to do it. The technology is there, and we now have the mechanisms such as energy as a service, these standard contractual terms, and the de-risking mechanism to help facilitate this. And finally, the opportunities and benefits should be shared with local communities, either through involving them in the projects themselves or extending the opportunities that electricity can bring. Thank you very much. If you have any questions, please contact myself or Mark, or visit www.humanitarianenergy.org. Thank you.